Michael Peress here. He is an associate professor of political science and economics at SUNY Stony Brook, also here in the government department this year. And he's going to be presenting on the economy, the media, and the vote.
Thank you, Pam. I should mention this is co-authored with my former colleague, Mark Heiser. So the relationship between the economy and incumbent vote share. So this is often referred to in the literature as the economic vote. The economy is typically measured using growth, unemployment, and inflation. We actually know a lot about the economic vote. I'll show you just a representative regression from the literature. So basically, if we have the incumbent prime minister's vote share as a dependent variable, growth has a positive effect on the incumbent prime minister's vote share, unemployment has a negative effect, inflation has a negative effect. So in other words, the incumbent prime minister's party is rewarded for high growth and is punished for high unemployment and high inflation. What we know a lot less about is how voters actually learn about the economy. So one hypothesis for how voters learn about the economy is through the media. So in this paper, we're going to look at two different aspects of this. We're going to look at media coverage of the economy, or how the media responds to the economy, and we're going to look at voter response to media coverage. So do voters actually punish incumbent governments for what the media is reporting in terms of whether it's good or bad? So we actually don't know that much about this. We don't know that much about how media reporting on the economy affects the vote, and we also don't know that much about how accurately media reporting reflects how the economy is doing, and in particular, we don't know that much about whether the partisanship of the newspaper affects what they report. So we're going to focus on three questions in this paper. We're going to focus on whether newspaper sentiment reflects the economy. We're going to look at whether newspaper partisanship biases reporting on the economy, and we're going to look at whether newspaper coverage mediates the economic vote. Or in other words, do voters punish incumbent governments when the economy is performing poorly, or when newspapers are reporting that the economy is performing poorly? So in the past, projects that have tried to look to see whether media reporting affects the economy, human coding has limited the scale. This is just one representative article. Soroka published this in JOP in 2006. It's actually a fairly big project. There's 5,000 articles for one newspaper, but even that is a pretty massive data coding project. In this paper, we're going to rely on machine coding, which is going to allow us to increase the scale. So we're going to focus on 16 different OECD countries, 32 newspapers, a left and a right-wing newspaper from each country. Across these 16 countries, we're going to have 6 different languages, and it's going to be about 2 million news articles that we're going to code. And we're going to measure sentiment across 3 different dimensions: growth, unemployment, and inflation, to match the economic vote literature. So there's a number of approaches we could take to coding the newspaper articles, coding sentiment in particular. So there's human coding, there's unsupervised learning, there's supervised learning, and there's dictionary coding. So right away we can throw out newspaper or human coding, because we're not going to be able to do that for 2 million newspaper articles. So the leftover approach is unsupervised learning is not going to work very well, just because there's no guarantee that what we get out of those clusters are going to be what we want. In fact, it's very unlikely that we're going to just come out with a cluster which is positive coverage of growth and negative coverage of growth and positive coverage of unemployment and so on. So we're left with the choice between supervised learning and dictionary coding. We're going to use dictionary coding. It's much easier to apply this across multiple languages. And the other thing is, if you think about what we're coding sentiment on growth or sentiment on unemployment. It's going to involve combinations of words. So we're not going to be able to detect it using single words. There aren't going to be single words that are going to denote positive growth. It's going to be positive words that are near words that indicate growth. So in order to capture that using some sort of supervised learning technique, we would have to consider fairly long strings of words. And once we do that, there would just be too many possibilities in terms of the words that we can consider. So it's much easier to incorporate that using dictionary coding. And I'll explain actually do that. So to oversimplify a little bit, this is what we do. We have a list of words that indicate growth. We have a list of words that indicate positive sentiment and a list of words that indicate negative sentiment. This is the actual list of words we use for English. The list of growth words, it's pretty short. Positive words and negative words, we actually take these from existing sentiment dictionaries. They tend to be very long lists of words. The dictionaries that we created for the 5 other languages we used are much shorter than these. Then what we do is we count the number of occurrences of growth words that are near positive words and the number of occurrences of growth words that are near negative words. And then growth sentiment is just the fraction of positive words where the denominator is the sum of these two things, growth words near positive words and growth words near negative words. So the fraction of that would be the positive sentiment on growth. Now what we actually do is a little bit more complicated than that. We take into account negations. So if there's a negation near a positive or negative word, it switches the meaning of the positive or negative word. We also take into account words that indicate increasing or decreasing. So words that indicate increasing are automatically positive if they're next to growth. If they're next to unemployment, they would, of course, automatically be negative. And then there's a separate set of words that we use to indicate a recession, where that would indicate negative growth sentiment. And then we have similar rules for unemployment and inflation. So the first thing we did is we looked to see whether newspaper sentiment reflects the economy. So
Michael, so
yeah.
Have you validated those measures? I mean, most of the text analysis literature says, don't do that. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, because
Yeah.
if it validates, if you actually hand code it and you show that it actually produces the same answer as hand coding,
Yeah.
then you're okay. So did you validate this on its own terms before seeing?
Okay, so that's one way to code it. That's one way to validate it relative to hand coding.
Right.
We're working on that. We don't have, the hand coding is very time intensive. We don't have it done yet.
Right.
There's other ways to validate it, basically based on the relationship to growth, unemployment, and inflation. And also we have different newspapers. We can correlate those newspapers. And in general, if the measure was invalid, it would cause measurement error and those correlations would be depressed. So the extent that the correlations are high should give you some confidence in the measure. I'll show you how high they are in a little bit, and you can tell me how convinced you are. But we're working on the coding relative to the validation relative to human coding. Okay, so we're doing something really simple here. Our dependent variable, I shouldn't say dependent variable, these are just correlations. We're looking at the correlation between the different dimensions of sentiment and the different measures of how the economy is doing. In all these cases, we're looking at things over a 1-year interval. So for example, growth would be over a period of a year. So if we correlate growth over a period of a year to growth sentiment, the correlation is 51%. If we look at unemployment, it looks like changes in unemployment are more correlated with unemployment sentiment than levels of unemployment. We see something similar going on for inflation. Now here we just arbitrarily picked a year. We can try different windows to see what the sentiment is actually responding to. I just highlighted the correlations that are biggest. What you can see is that a year seems to be the right window of time in terms of having the best fit. It seems like the newspapers are reporting how the sentiment is related to how the economy is doing over the last year. And
So so what's the unit of analysis? Is it aggregated?
oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mention that. This is monthly. Everything is aggregated to the month.
So how many newspaper articles are coded to aggregate it to the month?
Per month or total? Total is 2 million.
Or per month?
Per month, it depends on the newspaper. So there's about 6,000 months of data. So the average, I guess, what is that, like 300, 400? And in some cases, it's New York Times, Wall Street Journal, it's a very high number. There's a few newspapers, like the Portuguese newspapers, that are not that big.
So for a particular month, you take all of the text from a newspaper, think of it as a single document, find all of the instances of economy basically, and then score the sentiment and average. So basically, for each newspaper for each month, you have that newspaper's sentiment on growth, unemployment, or inflation.
Right. That's right. And the other thing you were asking is, we don't do things on an article by article basis. We put it all in one big chunk of text. So an article that, let's say, mentioned growth only one time, it would show up as one instance of growth positive within the month. If the article mentioned growth 100 different times, it would have a much bigger contribution to the overall measure of sentiment.
Because you're just looking for mentions of growth in the text of the newspaper. You're ignoring basically the article borders entirely.
I spent like a year or two throwing out all that stuff, but finally have that done, and these results are throwing out all the article borders and didn't make a difference. But
yeah, I'm sure it did.
So we can actually correct these numbers for measurement error because we have two newspapers within each country. When we did that, the correlations get a little bit higher, especially for inflation, but we find the same patterns. The sentiment responds to growth over a period of about a year and responds to changes in unemployment and inflation. Can do the same thing using a regression. In this case, we're able to look at simultaneously the relationship between growth, unemployment, and inflation for the three different measures. What we're looking for over here is, at minimum, we should see the correct signs along this diagonal. So growth sentiment should respond to growth, unemployment sentiment should respond to unemployment, and inflation sentiment should respond to inflation, and we do actually find that. But at the same time, we find that all the different measures of sentiment tend to respond to the measure of growth. This is looking at things on a newspaper by newspaper basis. So these are R-squareds for regressions where the dependent variable is sentiment and the independent variables are growth, unemployment, and inflation. We can see that the correlations vary somewhat across newspapers. Or I'm sorry, the R-squareds varied somewhat across newspapers. So in some countries, we're better able to explain the sentiment based on the economic variables. In some countries, it's worse. But none of them are particularly low. It's the next slide. And some of them are extremely high. Like the US, we get really high R-squareds. In the UK, we get really high R-squareds. So we can compare this to the relationship between the vote share for the incumbent prime minister's party and those same measures. The interesting thing is that the actual vote share, it tends to respond to immediate levels of unemployment and inflation. So it's both the fact that it's immediate and the fact that it responds to levels rather than changes. So this starts to tell us something about mediation. The fact that vote share responds to growth over a fairly long period of time means that that's at least consistent with the possibility of mediation. The fact that vote share responds to levels rather than changes and it responds to immediate rather than long-term means that we're unlikely to find mediation for unemployment and inflation.
How should we think about the 4-year lag when the PM's party is probably different? Like, isn't that sort of surprising that it's that high given the lag is that long? Or that, again, growth sentiment tracks the newspapers 4 years ago? Is that?
Well, I mean, the newspapers aren't sitting there and calculating the growth rate over a period and using that to determine whether to say nice things or to say bad things. They just have an overall feeling of the economy, and they may not necessarily remember when they're writing their text whether something happened before the current government was even in office in terms of judging how well the economy is doing at that point. I also wouldn't. There's a standard error to that lag, which this table is not showing.
Okay.
We ran this using distributed lag models, and we find the lag for growth is much higher than the lag for unemployment and inflation. But of course, there's some sort of standard error. So I wouldn't say that the lag is exactly 4 years, but I would say that it's longer than unemployment and inflation.
What were the factors behind the selection of the
So we tried to find, we wanted mainstream papers, not tabloid papers. We wanted papers with large circulation, and then we wanted papers that we could actually collect the data for. So these would be papers where we could get from electronic sources.
Because just picking one example, the German case is somewhat problematic, I feel, because you picked a newspaper and a daily or a weekly magazine,
Yeah.
which kind of like skews things also. I mean, I know that you, like, I get the categories, but both the German newspapers are rather elite, so I feel like you miss out on several things with the selection of newspapers.
In the German case, we were just limited by availability. We looked for the larger circulation papers, but they just weren't available in electronic form. So this is the relationship between the share of coverage. So, I'm sorry, you have a question?
Sorry, yeah, just, and I apologize if I missed this, do you include like editorial sections, or is this just the news?
To the extent that the electronic archives include editorials, the editorials would be in the analysis.
I wonder if that might actually generate extra noise, because you could have people like proposing solutions which may refer to the opposite of what is actually happening. Just a thought, if you can somehow separate out the editorials.
We definitely can't separate out the editorials. In terms of whether it's a problem, I don't think it's necessarily a problem. Our theory of what's going on here is people are reading the newspaper and they're just getting a sense of, an overall sense of how good the economy is doing, and that's affecting their vote. There's no reason to think that they don't form opinions based on editorials. So we think that they form opinions based on both sources.
But what I'm saying is, in bad economic times,
Yeah.
editorials may speak about the economy in growth in positive terms, right? They may say, here's what we need to improve the economy, get the economy growing. And so it actually will make the sentiment seem more positive in a negative time, and vice versa. That's why I said it would add noise to your measure. That's all. But you can't do anything about that.
I'm gonna show you what the lines look like for the left and right wing newspapers, and I think you'll see that the data are inconsistent with what you're suggesting.
Okay, cool.
But so here we're correlating. This is the fraction. So among the economic coverage, the fraction that's devoted to growth, unemployment, and inflation. Here what we find is that when growth is high, a lot less focus on growth. When unemployment is high, there's a lot more focus on unemployment. When inflation is high, there's a lot more focus on inflation. So the newspapers tend to focus on whatever is not doing so hot. Same results in regression form. Media tends to focus on whatever's bad.
Michael, is that just out of curiosity, is that a common finding in the sort of media studies literature about negative coverage? I mean, these newspapers also don't cover, for example, terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
I'm told. But as a side joke. But is that a general finding in the media studies literature about a sort of negativity bias? I mean, it's certainly consistent with various behavioral, like a prospect theoretic account, which is we're going to cover things in the domain of losses, but the domain of gains is not as interesting to people.
In terms of whether the literature covers that, I don't know of anything. If you know of anything, let me know. There's one article that talks about this, that finds this result but doesn't make a big deal out of it. This is a recently published article in AJPS by Stuart Soroka and Chris Swalazian and one other co-author. They find it's a different effect than we report, because they just find that the newspapers talk more about the economy when the economy is bad, where we're saying that they talk more about the particular areas of the economy where it's doing badly. But in terms of other areas outside the economy, I don't know of any results like that, but it doesn't mean they don't exist.
Question that, so you're saying that when growth is bad, they aren't talking about unemployment at elevated rates? Like, never mind.
What you're saying is true.
Okay.
So when the economy is doing bad, they talk more about the economy overall. And when one of these three things are bad, they talk more about one of those three things as a share of the other things. And
It gets increased share.
this effect is bigger than the other effect. So it doesn't happen that they talk more about unemployment total when the economy is when growth is doing bad.
Okay, so when things are bad, it's not elevating discussion of all three things overall. Like, so you have the
It's not
relative share.
it's not elevating it's elevating the sum of the three things, but it's not elevating the levels of all three things.
This is just your deepened variable here isn't sentiment though, right? This is just the mentions of the growth, unemployment, inflation terms. Is that right?
Right. The sentiment I showed you a few slides ago.
Yeah.
Okay, so we wanted to look at partisanship. The simplest thing that we can do is just correlate the time series for the left and right-wing newspaper in each country. So these are the correlations. These are much higher than I expected to find, just because I expected there to be a lot of measurement error in the series. And the correlations being this high suggests to me that there isn't that much measurement error in the series. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the left and right-wing papers are doing the exact same thing. This is still potentially consistent with the right-wing, left-wing paper doing different things, but at least they're moving in the same direction. So this is what the actual series looks like. So this is for each country. The red line is the left-wing paper, the blue line is the right-wing paper. And then in the background, the colors, blue would mean a right-wing government, red would mean a left-wing government. I wouldn't even bother looking at the colors for the backgrounds, just because the lines are so close to each other that it's hard to look at those lines and say that there is much bias.
But what's the vertical axis? Like
It's sentiment.
What's up and down?
Positive sentiment, higher positive sentiment, lower positive sentiment. I think I scaled it so it's between 0 and 1.
Just growth sentiment?
This is all three combined. If I did them, if I separated them out, then it would be the same basic picture, but I just wanted to show it all in one picture.
And how do you combine your positive and negative?
The overall sentiment would be the sum of growth positive, unemployment positive, inflation positive divided by growth positive plus growth negative plus unemployment positive plus unemployment, and so on.
And you're binning, so I'm still having trouble with what the data points are. The data points are your monthly sentiment for so why do you have higher resolution in some of the charts than others?
Because the newspaper, the ranges differ in terms of the range where we had dates. So for the Portuguese paper, this would be the window in time where we observed the series for both papers. And the window in time was very small. So I think one of the papers only ran for 2 years, and the other one ran for 5 years, whereas in the United States, I think one of the papers goes back to 1980, the other one goes back to 1989. So I just plotted the time period that includes both.
Okay, so our horizontal scales are all different.
Yeah.
So this says that left and right-wing papers, when they have sentiment, when they report, so could you just finish that sentence?
Yeah, let me show you 3 more pictures and then maybe ask your question again. I'm just going to blow those up a little bit. This is the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Red is New York Times, blue is Wall Street Journal. If you squint hard enough, you might be able to see that the New York Times tends to be more positive than the Wall Street Journal.
Positive about the economy?
About the economy.
So,
yeah.
But do you think it's the New York Times is saying that the level of economic growth or whatever it is at a good level? Is that what they're saying basically? And they're both reporting it on the same way?
I wouldn't say that specifically. the measure is picking up positive words and negative words, and the proportion of positive words relative to negative words that are near growth words.
Right.
So in
that's,
other-
that's the measure, but
Okay.
but you're using that to measure something. So
Yeah.
and that thing that you're using it to measure, we can.
So what I'm saying is, if you were to read the New York Times, then you would probably get a sense that the economy is good when that growth sentiment index is high.
Right.
Now it's obviously not exactly how humans interpret the text that they're reading, but we're hoping that this is a reasonable proxy for how the humans will interpret the text.
So the New York Times. So it's pretty interesting because that's like the most liberal paper and the most conservative paper in the mainstream papers, and they have almost the same view.
Right, and it's not just that there's a lot of measurement error, so the means look the same. You can see that this is actually capturing something, because these are two entirely different newspapers with two entirely different articles, and it's the same pattern.
Are they diverging, like towards the end? And what's I can't quite see. So is that 109 to
That's 109 to 113. So that's Bush, that's Obama, that's Clinton. That would be older Bush. Go ahead.
What if, as an alternate way to measure this, you like identified articles as being about the economy or sections of text as being about the economy, and then you could do some sort of supervised sentiment classification within those articles or something. I'm just wondering if
Okay.
you wonder if it was exactly the same, then when people raise the question that Gary had about kind of like, is this the right way to measure sentiment, you could just say, if you do something else, you get sort of similar looking trends. But I wonder if people will look at this because it is so surprising and think, well, it's either very, very interesting or kind of like failing some face validity thing. And it seems like you could kind of push against the latter concern by some sort of supervised theme of some subset.
So I think that the stories that you would tell about what could be going wrong with the measure would lead to measurement error. I think it's much harder to tell a story of something going wrong that's leading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal to have these very defined patterns that are the same. But we are going to do that to a certain extent. We're coding up English articles. I don't think we're going to be able to human code Portuguese articles.
Yeah, sure.
So it's going to be somewhat limited. And my tendency is to think that if we classify things on an article by article basis, if we measure the percentage of articles that are correctly classified, supervised learning is going to do better, but it's going to do better by picking up weird types of words. Like maybe during the recession, there's more talk about Lady Gaga, so Lady Gaga, the word Gaga will be associated with positive and we'll get garbage like that, which is useful for prediction, but is not really capturing any meaning in the text.
I mean, you can even have people just human coders do like 500 articles or something and show that correlates.
Well, right. And the other thing that we can do is for the left right wing comparisons, we don't need the 2 million articles. We'll once we have that done, we'll simply report the codings by the individuals. For the analysis that we do later, for the mediation, we need all 2 million articles, so that's not going to work. This we can show a million different ways. I think it's going to be the same thing. We just haven't finished all of them yet. Anton?
So the measure here seems to be capturing kind of what you want in that, you can look at that chart and identify three, spikes, the Great Recession, looks like after September 11th, and then I guess the savings and loan crisis under Bush 1, possibly. But it's not clear to me how this measure is capturing, apart from a binary indicator of like recession, no recession, because we're like the sentiment at the Great Recession is equivalent to the sentiment at like right after 9/11, when the magnitude of those two events was just extremely different, and arguably I'd say like it gets reported as such. Do you get the sense that there are certain challenges in capturing sentiment that's giving you what is essentially a discrete measure as opposed to this continuous measure? Like how is there a way that this measure captures intensity of the crisis as opposed to just there is a crisis?
I
looking
mean,
at those, it's like,
not every drop is the same in every single series.
right, but
I mean, there's something interesting going on in Spain there. There's a huge drop and then it stays. So,
Sure.
so I mean, your particular interpretation of the U.S. that I guess you're saying that this drop is bigger than that drop.
I'm
that-
saying it's the other way, but like empirically, the Great Recession was.
I mean, I would just interpret this as saying that the coverage is saying that the drops are equal. I wouldn't,
Okay.
because I don't have any reason to believe that the coverage should be the same. I'm not even sure that the drop in growth was bigger in this period than that period, but I haven't looked at those pictures.
I mean, I guess it's a question of, is it that media is divergent? Like, how would I be able to distinguish between media coverage is diverging from the objective coverage
Yeah.
from this medium measure doesn't capture the, like your coding measure doesn't capture the, depth of language used? Like, if
Yeah.
you were to give me that graph, like, how would I decide between those two explanations? Like, why should I believe that this is a media effect as opposed to a coding effect?
I mean, obviously, I can't. Obviously, I can't dispute that. I guess what you're saying is that the word like the words have there might be words indicating extremely negative growth and extremely positive growth and.
Possibly, or just some.
The human coding that we're doing is a 5-point scale, so we might be able to test that once we do the human coding. That's about all I can say.
I mean, it would be interesting if it were the case that like all recessions basically get covered the same. But just my prior on the coverage of the Great Recession, given that we're still covering it today, is that drop seems like it should be a little lower, but
That's not correct.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, is there any kind of like, so like the way, is there going to be a bit of over smoothing in terms temporally here because of how, like, you might you might have retrospective articles, right? The articles that talk about growth, there might write an article now about growth during the Great Recession, and it's going to mention how growth was so bad back then, and that's going to get coded up now as being like it's going to look like by this measure it's going to look like we're negatively covering growth
Right.
now, even though there's like a temporal element that's kind of missing in the language. So, do you think that's like is that a possibility here, or are those articles sufficiently rare? Do you think?
I think those articles are fairly rare.
Okay.
The human coding is going to look into that.
Yeah.
But I was passing through the articles. I was actually worried about the reverse problem, which is that the coders would never be able to. We have a coding of whether the article is reporting that the economy used to be bad, and I was worried that the coders are never going to check that off.
Right.
So.
So I actually think the most interesting thing here is the divergence between these two lines, and particularly in Obama's administration. I mean, maybe I'm just seeing things, but it looks to me like there is this bigger divergence at the end. Have you? Well, so wait, how far does when does that stop?
11/13, 2000.
2013.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see what it's like now, and if it's.
I mean, I'll show you the regression results. This is.
Like, how do we know if that's a meaningful divergence? Like, at what point?
Well, we know that it's a meaningful divergence because there's not that much measurement error in the series in the sense that it's capturing these recessions and growth periods. So relative to these changes, that difference is pretty small, I think. Let me show you the other two countries that I'm going to blow up. This is the UK. Again, if you squint hard enough, you'll see a partisan effect here, but it's a really small one. You'll see that the red line is lower in the blue areas and higher in the red areas. So maybe there's something going on for the UK, but it's really small. Matt?
Could you do the same thing on like press releases from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and like get a? I mean, it's not like with the official for the sentiment, obviously not for the coverage.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be like 100%.
Yeah.
But they're going to report every month, and they're going to like objectively. Or maybe you can just like report the actual kind of you could show the growth on there to see how it correlates. But I guess that's what you did earlier with the growth, the regressions measuring objective.
Well, no,
growth.
I'm going to show you.
Okay.
I think I'm going to show you the results if
Okay.
you want in a few slides.
So I'm curious about how the apparent lack of divergence might be a result of things like AP. Like if all these newspapers are relying on the same sources, maybe the cases where they're diverging, like maybe they all have this same source that's drawing their baselines from, and that the errors are just related to like their few partisan op-eds. In which case, you're picking up basically just that artifact.
I don't think so the newspapers, they borrow a lot from AP, but not for economic articles.
I wouldn't know, but
I mean, it seems easy to check, right?
Yeah,
Like you could
it's easy to check.
take each pair of newspapers in each
Yeah.
country and just see how many have virtually the same, how many have one article duplicated in the other newspaper.
Right.
And again, the U.S. is 10% of the sample. Most of this is newspapers not from the U.S.
Sure, but every newspaper relies on its own wire service, right?
Well,
Or
New York
on a
Times,
set of
New York
wire
Times and Wall Street Journal don't rely. I mean, they really try to be independent, but they do follow each other. They, if one of them has a breakthrough news story, the other one will have a breakthrough news. We'll write about that story. In fact, so it may be that you're seeing something like that. But
Dustin?
So I'm less surprised maybe than some about this strong correlation, especially in institutional contexts where the signal coming from government and the rest of the economy is actually extremely well studied, both by the government but also numerous investors, etc. So one tact to be able to show that this is really tight is to identify a case where that informational signal, like a country where that informational signal is going to be at much lower fidelity, which then opens up the opportunity for much greater differential reporting. And I don't know if in your country sample you have such a case, but that would be one way to engage with that.
I mean, these are the pictures. There's no country in the sample that's
so
consistent.
these are all OECD. Yeah. So I mean but that would be, the point being is that there's just such a clear signal because these are very. Another way of putting this is the markets in all these countries are very thick. I don't know about Luxembourg. I don't know anything about Luxembourg, in fact, but for the rest, it's like very thickly traded markets.
Okay.
Right. And so the signal is actually really clear.
Yeah.
And hence I just there's not much room for maneuvering left right. Whereas that would break down in other contexts when the sort of the price signal, if you will, is decidedly less.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, but I think that this is part of the point. I mean, that the newspapers are reporting the same thing.
No, absolutely.
It doesn't necessarily matter whether they're doing that because of AP articles, because in the end, people are reading those articles. So if the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are reporting the same things, then there isn't that much room for people to come up with very biased views.
I think it works very well for your story.
And again, I'm focusing on on the economy. I don't want anybody to interpret this as saying that newspapers are not biased.
But that's precisely that is my point, in that they are unbiased in cases where it's a thickly traded signal.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And for all these other things, I mean, we don't have a price market for abortion.
Yeah.
Right. And it just leaves a lot more leeway. Right. And I think that's what you're picking up on here.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
So let me show you the regression results. Okay, so basically what we did here is we sentiment as a dependent variable. We controlled for growth, changes in unemployment, changes in inflation. We have a variable which is ideological match, which is basically one if it's left-wing government, left-wing newspaper, or right-wing government, right-wing paper, and 0 otherwise. And then we interact those with the economic variables. So you're looking for statistical significance over here. Don't see it for articles. We also looked at headlines. Similarly, we don't see anything statistically significant. The only thing we found is that those two coefficients are jointly significant. These are what the effects look like. The purple line is matched papers, orange line is unmatched papers. And again, you can see that there's a pretty strong response to the economy, particularly among growth. But match papers and the unmatched papers are doing essentially the same thing. Can show you similar results for coverage. Here we actually find that, so this coefficient over here means that match papers are saying more positive things about unemployment when unemployment is high and less positive things when it's low. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Match papers are spending more time covering unemployment when unemployment is low and less time covering unemployment when unemployment is high. So all the papers are focusing more on the bad, but the match papers are focusing somewhat less on the bad relative to the unmatched papers. So we do have a statistically significant effect there. Nothing for headlines, but when we actually look at the pictures, that's the only one where there's statistical significance. Now I could blow that up and make it seem more consequential. There's a difference of maybe, if you look for the high point to the low point, there's a difference of maybe 5 or 6% in terms of the coverage. So there's an effect there, it's statistically significant. It's not completely negligible in magnitude, but it's small relative to how much the papers are responding to the actual unemployment rate. So the differences between the matched and unmatched papers are small relative to their responsiveness to the actual economy. Okay, so the last thing we wanted to look at is mediation. Start with the basic economic vote model. So vote share is a dependent variable, growth, unemployment, and inflation are the controls. These are the same results I showed you earlier, just restricted to those 16 countries. You can see that the inflation coefficient is no longer statistically significant, but we still see an effect for growth and unemployment. That 211 sample size, that's going to cause problems just because once we start restricting that to the elections where we actually observe the newspaper data, that's going to become even smaller and we're going to have power problems. So what we did is we collected vote intent data. So this is from surveys that indicate whether the person was intending to vote for the incumbent prime minister's party. We see a similar pattern of results. Vote intent, response probability, growth, negative to unemployment. So we add sentiment to that regression in building our mediation model. In the third equation over here, we can see that once we include the growth sentiment, unemployment sentiment, inflation sentiment, the only thing that's statistically significant is levels of unemployment, and it has a negative effect. And really the problem over there is the 100 data points. We can go through the mediation analysis. So we take that equation right there, but we also model sentiment as a function of these economic variables. And then if we plug these three equations into that equation, we end up with these three coefficients right here. So the idea is that beta 1 plus beta 4 times gamma 1 growth, that represents the entire growth effect. Part of that is a direct effect. That's our beta 1. And part of it is an indirect effect, which is beta 4 times gamma 1g. So we can basically take that total effect and decompose it into an effect that works through growth sentiment, which is the indirect effect, and a part that doesn't work through growth sentiment, which is our beta 1, our direct effect.
Michael, doesn't go back? Doesn't sort of economic theory suggest that that we're almost certainly not in a world where these mediators are independent of each other, like causally, right? So like unemployment. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but I would seem to think that some of those things are downstream from each other, right? Like inflation is going to have an impact on growth, but not necessarily the other way around. I don't like.
Yeah.
I just in general, I'm not sure I can. I'm having a hard time thinking that those mechanisms are independent of each other. In which case, the sort of canonical Baron-Kenny type plug-in estimate is going to be wrong.
I mean, I wouldn't go so far as saying that growth couldn't affect unemployment.
Yeah, I mean, I caveated that with I'm not an economist.
Yeah.
But in principle, it seems like I don't know. I'm just putting it out there that that would be.
Yeah.
I would want some sort of economic justification that none of these things are systematically, causally attributed to the other, in order to justify this econometric strategy.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I would just say keep that in the back of your mind when you're interpreting the results, and if you have something specific in terms of like what could be going wrong, but I wouldn't go so far as to make the claim that none of these variables could causally affect any of the other variables. So we always have to make some simplifying assumptions in
Sure.
terms of
Yeah,
causal
yeah.
arrows.
Yeah.
But the do the exclusion restrictions, are they relevant here in terms of like leaving unemployment out of the growth sentiment equation and so on? Like, is it, or is it? I mean, you showed us some evidence earlier, but I'm having a hard time kind of just exactly piecing it together. But is it the case that?
Well, I could run the analysis leaving out the exclusion restrictions. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't make a difference. If you remember, I showed you previously that unemployment sentiment depended on changes in unemployment, but the vote share depended on levels of unemployment.
Right.
That by itself is basically making it almost impossible for indirect effects of unemployment.
Right. Okay.
I'm pretty sure based on the regressions that I've run that we're going to find the same results. Let me first show you the non-result, and then I'll show you the result. So this is, of course, based on just vote share. Of course, we see that unemployment has a direct effect, but nothing else is statistically significant. That's the problem with our 100 data points. So this is on vote intent. You can see here that we got statistically significant, correctly signed coefficients on growth, unemployment, growth sentiment, and inflation sentiment. And we have this incorrect but barely statistically significant sign on inflation. So we can run that through the mediation analysis. We end up with direct effects of unemployment, no indirect effect. For growth, we have both a direct effect and an indirect effect. And then we have a marginally statistically significant but incorrectly signed direct effect for inflation. If you look at growth, it looks like the direct effect is somewhat bigger than the indirect effect. Although, of course, you can't reject the null that those two are equal. Max?
How are you measuring growth and unemployment?
Um,
I only ask because I know you have another paper with Kaiser where you
Yeah.
say actually you should benchmark it to get kind of meaningful results on economic indicators for vote share. And
we
I wonder,
didn't do the benchmarking because we don't want to tie this publication to an argument we made in another article that people may not necessarily completely buy into.
Right, but I wonder because you find quite different results when you do the benchmarking.
Yeah.
I guess theoretically I wonder if you believe that article about benchmarking, then isn't this the sort of wrong way to be measuring growth and unemployment for the thing you care about?
I wouldn't go quite that far. I would say that if you believe our article, then measuring growth the way we do over here introduces some measurement error. So that's basically what we find, that the effects are somewhat stronger for growth if you benchmark it. I've actually run the analysis with benchmarking. It's the same.
Okay.
I mean, the same means the same stars in the same places.
Sure.
But we just didn't want we didn't want people only to believe this article if they believed our other article.
Right.
Okay, so there's one thing that's missing from this, which is that how are we measuring growth sentiment, unemployment sentiment, and inflation sentiment? We have two newspapers in each country. The mechanism we're looking for is the media is affecting the vote. The media is not two newspapers. The media is 50 newspapers or whatever. So the way we deal with this is we have two measures from each country. So we view that problem as that we have a measure of sentiment that's measured with error. So we use instrumental variables to basically instrument for the measurement error in one paper using the other paper, so that we have some way of extrapolating what the effect would be for the media rather than just our two papers. That's the analysis we have here. You can see that the coefficients are basically the same, with the exception that that incorrectly stated marginally statistically significant inflation coefficient is now just not significant at all. We plug that into the mediation analysis. We have, again, direct and indirect effects of growth, direct effects of unemployment, and we have this marginally statistically significant indirect effect for inflation, which I don't necessarily believe because that one bounces around a lot in different specifications. But the unemployment and growth effects from the previous analysis hold up once we correct for measurement error. So basically what we find is that newspaper tracks the economy surprisingly well. We don't find any evidence of partisan or ideological bias in newspapers. There might be something going on for the quantity. It's statistically significant, but given how small it is, I wouldn't make too much even of that effect. Mostly the newspapers are actually reporting what the economy is doing. And then we find that growth effects are partially mediated by newspapers. Unemployment effects are entirely direct, so not mediated by newspapers. And inflation, the effects are indeterminate. We can't really say for sure whether it's direct or indirect effect or whether there's no effect whatsoever. If we put this all together, this is also consistent with the idea that unemployment, that's mostly pocketbook voting. That comes from both the fact that the vote relies on immediate levels of unemployment and also because it's entirely direct effect. Growth seems to be a mix of pocketbook and sociotropic voting. And then finally, even if you believe that result of unemployment, which is that the newspapers focus more on unemployment, or that there's some partisan bias in how much they focus on unemployment, it really doesn't matter given what we found in the mediation analysis because the unemployment vote seems to be entirely direct. That's all I have.
So I actually am not surprised either that there wasn't partisan bias differences in the coverage of the economic sentiment. I wonder, especially since you're looking at the effect on the economic vote, if the more relevant variable would be economic policy sentiment. Because I think, so I say this because I think newspaper sentiment of the economy actually tracks the hard numbers of the economy very well. To the point where when, so I used to trade US rates before I started grad school, and so we would use newspaper sentiment of just the economy, exactly what you did, to try to get a more frequent measure of, let's say, inferring stuff about GDP growth or unemployment. But what we also wanted to know was kind of like the partisan, like the policy, how economic policy is going and how that would, because we were interested in how it would shift the economy, but maybe it would also shift, let's say, reader sentiment. So we were looking at kind of like newspaper sentiment, but tacking on. So in the search, tacking on, let's say, mentions of policies like Congress legislation, stuff like that within that same, let's say, paragraph where one of your words would have been picked up for growth. I wonder just if you thought about maybe using not just economic sentiment, but kind of like economic policy sentiment.
I've never heard that term before.
Okay, so there's Simon Baker. I'm not sure if you've looked at this, but Simon Baker at Stanford, I think, has a economic policy kind of newspaper time series, day by day, in which he's doing something similar. And that's kind of like we actually used to trade exactly on his time series that he would publish every day. But that kind of does the same thing, but just kind of tacks on this policy politics type of dimension onto the sentiment. So it's more like what's the newspaper sentiment not on the growth of the economy, but how the federal government is handling the growth of the economy. And I think if you did that, you would probably be able to get some partisan bias when you're comparing, let's say, Wall Street Journal and New York Times. I think it'd be more surprising then if there wasn't a difference between those two newspapers then.
Do dictionaries exist for those terms already, or?
I think he has. Yeah, I think he made one. Yeah. So I'm not. If you wanted to look into that, I can show you his stuff. But.
Yeah, the thing that we're working on actively now is separating out domestic from international.
Okay.
To see if there's different patterns over there. That's the only thing we've been working on in terms of new dictionaries. We haven't thought about looking at policy.
Have you checked whether the results are robust if you leave out one of the counters at a time?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on which results you're talking about. The newspaper results are super robust. You can do anything. I'm sorry, the bias results are super robust. You can do anything to them and they'll stay.
In that case, I would just leave out Switzerland from the whole paper because the story of the economy, everything institutional, it doesn't work at all with Switzerland.
I mean, that's
Also,
the interesting thing in Switzerland in the sense that voters actually do punish the incumbent government for poor economy, even though it doesn't make sense that they should.
But that's why I'm worried. So
yeah,
I mean, whoever reads it and knows about the institutional setting in Switzerland says it cannot work.
Well, no,
So
it can work if voters don't understand how the.
No, but because there are no incumbents.
I'm sorry?
There are no incumbents.
There are incumbents.
No. We elect the parliament.
Yeah.
And only by chance the executive is changing because somebody's retiring due to that. But the constellation of the executive is always the same. It's representative all of the big parties.
Oh no, I understand how it works. That they have a permanent agreement between the parties. But I've run the analysis just on Switzerland. I've run the economic vote analysis, and the incumbent governments are punished in Switzerland.
I'm just saying there are no incoming governments. They're the same.
So you're telling me that
elections
somebody in Switzerland wouldn't know who the prime minister is, and wouldn't know the party of the person? I'm sorry.
Maybe we can talk later.
I'm sorry. I'm using the wrong term, but there is a person who leads the government.
Wait. Let me just ask the question. What's the form of government?
In Switzerland, they have so the way it works is they have a bunch of parties, and they basically have some agreement where I think there's 7 ministries or something like that, and they have some agreement where this party gets 1 or 2 ministries every time, and this party gets 1 or 2 ministries every time, and
regardless of the election.
And then they have somebody who's the head minister, and I don't remember what it's called, and that person changes, but the election results are completely irrelevant.
But the idea, I mean, is this basically Singapore, or is this like a city manager form of government?
I don't know what Singapore is.
System, so there's some historical path dependency that's resulted in this formula. What's the exact composition of this 7 positions? So,
I mean, if one party won more seats,
yeah, that doesn't change.
They wouldn't get. If one party won all the seats, they would still give one of the ministries to the opposition.
Because they don't change. The executive doesn't change due to the election. By coincidence, it could be if somebody retires and then the new biggest party says, well, now we should renegotiate this because now we want 2 seats, and before only the last 20 years we only had 1 seat, and now this seat is empty, so now we should get it. But over this time period, this happened like twice.
But the ministers aren't drawn from the legislature?
Yeah, from the legislature, but they're in office until they get retired, and the head of the government is changing every year.
Imagine if every single year in the UK, the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party and the Conservative Party were always in the governing coalition, all 3 parties. That's what it's like in Switzerland.
And the same proportion in the governing coalition.
Yeah. There's no coalition.
So what does
the election do?
Yeah. So where
does the composition of the parliament?
And the
That's what he's saying. It doesn't.
So what happens is, we have a hang up. We have this hang up about democracy, and so the idea is that if the voters think something different and they elect different people, they would pass different laws, but the same bureaucracy would be administrative. So it's sort of like Britain, right, where they have nonpartisan civil service. That's sort of the idea, right?
No, it's a bizarre system.
But does the
things that are.
But does the executive have veto power?
Sorry?
Does the executive have veto power?
No.
Okay.
Do you remember like
people-
you remember like 10 years ago when Israel, they decided to have this giant coalition with everybody in the coalition because there were some terrorist attacks?
That's
Imagine if that happened when there was no terrorist attacks, and instead of lasting for a month, it lasted for, I don't know, 40 years? How long does it go back?
So is the point that people are punishing the people in like the majority parliament party in Switzerland?
Whichever party happens to hold whatever that's at least what I found in the data. This is completely beside the paper,
It
but
doesn't make sense because you cannot punish the executive in the
But you
national
may not
election.
actually be able to do it. That doesn't stop
but,
you.
but voters do all kinds of crazy things.
Yeah, like, I mean, you can punish a party if you have like
Yeah.
the strongest party and you don't agree with their
Yeah.
economic policy, then you can punish them. But that's not what you have in the data, because that you would need the composition of the parliament with that. That's my point.
Surely what you could be finding is that whoever the rotating prime minister is, that person is more visible, so people that are unhappy are more likely to punish them. And when the economy is bad, they just focus on who's the kind of most visible rotating party at the time. And that might be irrational, but that could easily explain your results, right? And that would be sort of the plausible story you could tell. Even in Switzerland, even though in some sense they shouldn't be doing it, they focus on whoever the prime minister's party is when the economy is bad for its target. And that's like a fairly standard, like that seems like a fairly easy explanation for why it's working in Switzerland.
People who live in complicated parliamentary systems don't understand how they work anyway.
Yeah.
People in Israel, like I asked them, and they think that they vote directly for the president. They don't know, and they vote, and they just forget within those 2 years that they don't directly vote for the president. So that it never really surprised me that there were effects there. But I went on a tangent, but we have run the analysis without Switzerland. Doesn't change anything.
This is almost as interesting as the paper.
So can you talk for a second about, you know, you were very careful to parse out the economy with respect to this project. If you were to want to do this in some other sort of arena of politics, what would it be?
So one thing that I thought of doing was to come up with a dictionary of terms that relate to the Democratic or Republican Party. So Democratic, Republican, Pelosi, Obama, Trump, things like that. And try to get sentiment along that and see if there's differences in sentiment. Now, the difficulty with that is that I can do that for the US, I can't do that for yeah, and I don't really like the idea of studying the US because I think we're gonna pick up things that are, first of all, we're relying on a single time series, and it's hard to learn anything from a single time series. So we've been trying to figure out ways to do that across multiple countries when we can come up with a dictionary that will indicate positive sentiment for left and right-wing governments.
So I wonder if you could use the comparative manifesto project text sources and, you know, in a sense, isolate proper noun-y sort of things from that as an inductive way to do that, right? Because that's going to give you essentially a list of, you know, as each of these parties is issuing a manifesto, it's going to give you a list somewhere probably of who the actors are or what the terms are that are somehow uniquely special to what that party is saying or trying to do. You're just saying you want an inductive way to identify things like Democratic, Republican, Pelosi, elephant.
I didn't necessarily mean an inductive way. I guess what I would do is if I could get 16 me's from 16 different countries who happen to live in those countries, I could come up with a dictionary for the U.S. and somebody else could come up with a dictionary from Luxembourg. Somebody else could come up with a dictionary for Switzerland.
Well, the temporal problem is what's going to hit you, right? Because Pelosi changes, and that's why the manifestos might be a
because that tracks over time.
Yeah.
I mean, you would not just
We-
need
so we
16
can-
U's.
we can-
You would need 16 U's over the past 20 years.
Well, no, but I could do it for the last 20 years for the U.S., right? I mean, I know who was president. I can look to see who was the leader of the different parties over time.
Who was Treasury Secretary in 1998?
No, he doesn't.
Well, I have Google, but no, but you know, I know what to look for the
Right.
U.S.
Okay.
I wouldn't
Yeah,
know
yeah.
what to look. I don't know what the Treasury Secretary is called in Switzerland. I'm
Couldn't
sure-
you use like list of candidates, right? Well, for countries that have specific candidates,
Yeah.
you could use that as like an automated, year after year, the people that you would want to look for.
Yeah, I mean, we've thought of doing things like that, but it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to come up with something that would be defensible. But I can look at the raw manifesto text and see if that might help. Matt?
What about like national security, or you know what I mean? Like it seems like you might be able to come up with a list of terms that related to national security that you could use, and those are going to be more somewhat constant over the last 20 years. Or there's some changes, pre-post 9/11, or maybe not even that much.
Yeah.
And then you could look at sentiment. For
Okay.
because I was thinking about crime as one that you could see driving a difference in least bias. I think newspapers are going to cover crime in different ways.
Yeah.
But crime doesn't seem to be important. I mean,
I like the crime idea just because you can get a statistic that we can correlate with it.
yeah, there's a number of crimes. So but I mean, whether it impacts national policy or national, I mean,
But all of these examples, I wouldn't expect to find bias.
Yeah.
I think that
Wouldn't
you'd have
expect
to
to find bias on reporting of crime rates.
partisan bias.
I think you might because you
Chris,
still
you're-
have
it doesn't.
you have a statistic to correlate it with,
Tell
Yeah.
but then there's also kind of like I think the parties argue with whether or not like crime reporting is accurate or not versus like not the parties aren't going to argue with whether the GDP growth rate is accurate or not.
although I mean, Trump does both.
No.
Trump does both economic
But I think
indicators
like
and
you have the number for crime, so you can have that correlation. But I think that number itself is more subjective than some of these hard numbers for.
If you use homicide, it's like incontrovertible. Like there's no missing data on homicide rates. So.
But you may not. I mean,
No, I mean, what I'm saying is I think that Dustin's idea of finding some place where there would actually be bias at this point is more profitable than finding more areas. And I think that the mechanisms for not finding bias in crime and not finding bias in national security would be similar to why we don't find bias in the economy.
But I mean, one thing you might want to. I mean, if I mean, the Wall Street Journal has this kind of reputation for having a split between its editorial page, right, and its news page.
Yeah.
And so now that doesn't carry over to the other countries, so it seems like there's a real non-bias being picked up here. But
Yeah.
But you might think that even for these other things, you might find a rough agreement between the New York Times news page and the Wall Street Journal news page.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is to say that maybe if you did a slightly bigger sample in a couple of countries, I wonder if you could find more divergence.
So you asked a standard Americanist question.
Sure.
I don't think that people would say that the Guardian and the London Times. I accept your argument for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
I don't think that people would say the same thing about the Guardian and London Times. Yeah. And if all we were reporting was just an average ideology effect across the 16 countries, then it would be possible. I think that when you actually look at the series, it's hard to argue that there's bias showing up in some countries and not in other countries because the lines are tracking each other so closely, even in countries where the newspapers we have, everybody would agree that they're very far apart. So
But I mean,
if all we were showing was this, then
well, what I'm saying is that
Yeah.
like if you took this and applied it to a different context where
yeah,
it's not so required. Like this is kind of like it's required that all of these newspapers cover these. Cover when the BLS or whatever, when the state agency puts out the numbers, like you have to report it.
yeah,
And you're gonna say there's a kind of like a requisite you're reporting an objective fact. And it's very difficult to this is just an earlier point, which is part of your point, which is that there's like there's no bias. It's like they report things as they come out. But
I don't think it's hard to. I mean, you could say that 3% is tepid growth.
Right.
That's
but I'm
really
saying-
easy to say.
But empirically,
Because who knows what 3% is?
But empirically, what you're finding, and that was interesting here, is that that doesn't happen as much as you might think.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that as you move away from where instances where the signal is not necessarily as clear,
Yeah.
or the agreement among say experts is not necessarily as clear about what is good and what is bad,
Okay.
like crime or national security, I think you might see more diversions.
Global warming and temperature. Temperature is about as precisely measured as any of these things.
Depends on the country.
No, sure. Yeah.
I think immigration would be an issue where coverage is like obviously different. At least maybe not with mainstream media as much, but like things like Breitbart, immigration is the top covered thing, but like a mainstream news article wouldn't. So I think you might
Yeah.
see divergence on. I mean, it's the same point, but that's an issue area where I think this divergence might be more obvious.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I like it. Max?
So I guess I might have missed this, but imagine you find some area where there is divergence. What's the story you then want to tell for effect on vote share?
I think that Dustin's original point is that if you ask people, is the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times different? Everybody's going to say yes. And in this particular area, we're not picking up a difference. So Dustin would believe the fact that there isn't a difference to a greater extent if we were to apply similar methodology to someplace else and actually find a difference. I think that was Dustin's point.
Yes.
That's why I think that crime. I like the idea because there's an official statistic.
Crime. Yeah.
But you know, if I have to spend a year collecting the data,
That was Dustin.
based on my prior finding a difference between left and right wing papers, I would put like a 10% prior probability, and I couldn't make the finances work out. Immigration, I'd be more likely to. I think there would be a difference if we came up with a good dictionary of left and right wing. Then I think that we would find a difference over there. But before I started this project, I would have expected to find the difference on coverage of the economy. That was my prior. Matt?
No, I mean, it's again Americanist in me, but like could you get access to things like to get like transcripts from TV? You know, so the things like especially the cable news. I mean, like just some place where we'd expect, like, we know some bias exists somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So it might be good to have a case where just to show that this isn't going to pick up bias when it is. You know what I mean? Like, it'd be nice to have a case where we know there was bias and this picks up the bias.
Yeah.
Just the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Like, if you read the headlines of the same stories, like this bias, right? I mean, you can tell. Not on everything, and maybe not on this.
Yeah.
But so I don't think you need different data. Maybe you just need a different topic.
I mean, I have a grad student who has the 3 cable news networks.
Yeah.
And we're gonna run that analysis after we publish this paper.
Yeah, I did.
Because it just makes it makes it complicated. I mean, first of all, we don't want to put it in the same paper, and then I don't like to have 2 papers going around on 2 similar topics before one of them is at least accepted for publication. But I mean, in terms of the point, I agree that cable news would be one place to look where I still, even after seeing these results, I still would expect to find something over there.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.